When discussing retirement, financial planners' typical advice is to invest diligently in a diversified portfolio during your working career and then reap the rewards in retirement. My guest is Michael Kitces. He writes in his blog, which was quoted in the New York Times, that if you really read between the lines, you are actually making a big gamble over the last decade that your portfolio will double in value. Michael is the Director of Research at the Pinnacle Advisory Group in Columbia, Maryland. He is in traffic right now driving in D.C. Michael, thanks for taking the time.
My pleasure. Happy to be here on a hands-free headset.
Yes, we're all safe. Thank you very much. So talk about what you mean here, the last decade. What's going on here?
Well, this is all based on, if we kind of wind back the traditional financial planning, personal finance advice, that one virtue we've kind of at least tried really hard to pound into people is, start saving, save when you're young. And the younger that you start, the less you actually have to save because the power of compounding works for you and that allows you to kind of get this positive snowballing effect as your retirement savings grow and grow forward until you hit that final point 40 years out. You've got started in your 20-somethings, you're now 60-something, and you're ready to retire. And, that's sort of a staple of the financial planning industry advice. Start young, save steadily, and basically let compounding work for you. And while that's certainly well and good, and I don't mean to detract from that as advice, it has this unique problem that I don't think we really give enough acknowledgement to, which is this strange sensitivity that emerges in the final decade. So if we're saving for 40 years, from 22 until 62, what happens in that final point when you enter into your mid to late 50s and you're in the home stretch towards your 60s? And it's simply a reality of what happens. It is the mathematics of compounding, often known as the rule of 72, that says if you divide the number of years into 72, that's how long it takes for your money to double. So if you're growing at 10%, your money doubles in about 7.2 years. If you're growing at 9%, your money doubles in about 8 years, etc. Well, what ends up happening if you're taking this steady stream of savings towards retirement because your goal is to generate that lump sum that you want when you're finally ready to retire and you've been doing your diligent saving for 40 years in order to get to that point, or for at least the first 30 years to get to that point, implicit in whatever that savings recommendation was the idea that compounding is going to work for you, which means in essence, if you're projecting anywhere between about call it 7 to 10% rate of return, depending what assumptions you like to use, it basically means you're counting on your investment returns to double in value over the last 7 to 10 years. That's what the math gets us from the rule of 72. And, if you break down what the math looks like over 40 years of steady savings, what you find is on the plus side, it takes remarkably little saving to generate a very large amount of money over 40 years. You can save $300 a month, and if you get a steady 8% return, you've got $1 million after 40 years. The problem is when you're still 30-something years into that 40 years, you haven't even gotten to the $500,000 mark yet. And saving $300 a month isn't going to come remotely close to getting you there. The only thing that's going to get you there is that last doubling that we're counting on from the compounding.
Especially if you turn the age of 50 and as you approach the year 2007, things could look quite differently in retirement for you.
Well, absolutely. We talk about how markets are kind of volatile and uncertain, and it's a staple of both the financial planning industry and the personal finance side overall that says, well, markets are going to be a little volatile and unsteady. No one says you're going to get this great rate of return over any particular number of years. The idea is it's a pretty steady and reliable turn over a long period of time. So as long as you have a long time horizon, taking some risk in stocks is an appropriate investment. And certainly when we're talking to the 20-something-year-old about a 40-year time horizon, that seems pretty prudent. The problem is by the time you get to 50-something, now you're actually counting on the same returns and the idea that your money doubles every 7 to 10 years. The problem is now it's not just every 7 to 10 years for decades. You need it to work this 7 to 10 years or you suddenly have a retirement crisis. And I think in essence that's much of what we're witnessing for, frankly, the average baby boomer who was born between 46 and 64, who was getting into their mid-late 40s, maybe early 50s by the turn of the past decade. And so we had a lot of people, particularly the front end of baby boomers nationwide, who had just reached their early 50s in the year 2000, who were counting on the subsequent decade to give them the last doubling they needed to retire. And instead of doubling their money over the decade barely let them keep their money as it was at the start.
Which is why the studies show that the average baby boomer can't retire until the age of 73. So what's the solution here? Is it simply just saving a little more money in the beginning, or is there a completely different strategy that has to be undertaken?
Well, I think there are two ways that you can go about tackling this, and it depends a little bit on your personal inclination. The first is, frankly, yes, you save a more, and possibly not a trivial amount more. You save a lot more, and in the process of saving more, you invest much more conservatively. You invest in something that is going to provide a steadier state return. And it's not so much about the volatility of returns per se. It's that, in essence, less volatile investments means your retirement date is less volatile. So, if we were really going to be fair when we tell folks, here's a 40-year savings plan about how you can invest steadily in a portfolio with a healthy exposure to stocks and retire in 40 years, we really should probably be saying 40 years plus or minus 5 to 10. Mm-hmm. This is a steady path to get you to retire somewhere between your early 50s and your early 70s.
And it seems prudent to also add in some plans for making house down payments, paying for college and things like that, which oftentimes isn't talked about in the beginning.
Certainly, and there's a separate body of research that's starting to emerge a little bit on that out of actually some of the economists doing work in this area, and a broader movement called Lifecycle Banana, which looks at how we have some of our savings and spending patterns, and the fact that, in essence, we may try to keep our consumption at a fairly level state throughout our lives, but because other fixed payments come in and out, we have a mortgage and then we don't, and then we need to pay for kids' college, then we don't, and then we need to finish saving for retirement, then we don't, that the level of savings towards one particular goal, like retirement, might not actually be so steady state in the first place. It may be lower in the early years and higher in the later years because that's what the demands of life give us. And I suppose in some indirect way, part of what you can draw from a little bit of the research and the ideas I'm putting forth is that although I don't really want to tell anyone, just put off all your savings until later and you'll get around to it eventually, it does in essence mean that unless you really want to count on that doubling up coming in the final decade, which is somewhat unreliable, you really will have to do a lot of saving. And you can do a lot of saving towards the end and actually make up a lot of ground because you may not have gotten the early returns that you were counting on anyways because they are still more uncertain than maybe we give them credit to be.
So finally, given the current market conditions, let's say, for example, we use somebody who's just turned 50 years old. They're a good 10, 15, maybe 20 years from retirement. What should they be considering? What should they be looking at or doing right now?
Well, I would boil it down this way. The first question is not only when would you like to try to retire, but how certain do you want that date to be? Is it, well, I'd like to retire in about 10 or 15 years and I'll deal with a little bit of what life gives me? Or is it, I want to retire right at 62 and I want to be really focused in on that goal and a very tight time period around that goal? And in essence, what I think we get to is the more certainty you would like for your goal, the more you need to save and the more conservatively you need to invest in order to get there. It's not enough to simply say stocks for the long run for everyone because not everybody is willing to be comfortable with that uncertainty, that time window around, well, we could aim for 62, but it could turn out to be 56 if stocks are great or 72 if stocks are bad. Are you willing to take that risk? And that becomes an individual decision, but what it takes us back to is if you're willing to be a little bit uncertain in where that target date is, go ahead and take a little bit of risk in investing in equities. And, certainly we have a lot of very good research that suggests in most cases things will go quite fine for you. But if the idea of having a delay is untenable, consider trying to save more and investing more conservatively and building your base that way instead. What you end out with is maybe a little bit less spending now and a little bit more of a savings obligation, but much less sensitivity to what happens in the markets and the markets dictating when you get to retire.
My guest is Michael Kitces. He is Director of Research at the Pinnacle Advisory Group in Columbia, Maryland. Michael, it is a pleasure. Thanks for taking the time today.
Absolutely happy to be of service.
I'm Scott Drake. Thanks for watching Annuity News Now.